Have you ever wanted to know what provisions you need in your lease purchase agreement, or as it's known in Delaware, a conditional sales agreement? Have you ever wondered what other provisions you may want in your conditional sales agreement? Have you ever wanted to know how to explain what some of these provisions mean? If so, stay tuned for all that and much more.
Hi, I'm wdolan, and this is Esquire Advice, where we explain complicated and lucrative real estate and business topics. Remember, we are not forming a lawyer-client relationship by way of this channel. Always consult your local attorney before taking any action. With that said, grab a pencil and a piece of paper and get ready to learn.
Welcome to our episode on lease purchase agreements, or as it's known in Delaware, a conditional sales agreement, with a special emphasis on the conditional sales agreement that I used with my investor clients. However, before we dive in, please kindly hit those like and subscribe buttons so we can keep bringing you valuable and profitable content. Okay, a Delaware conditional sales agreement is a document that looks vastly different than generic lease purchase agreements. Agreements for deed, contracts for deed, and installment land sale contracts, because a lease purchase type of transaction needs to conform to 25 Del C 314. From a lawyer's perspective, every transaction can have different facts or issues, and states have different laws. Each of these reasons could create the need for customizing any kind of agreement. However, between my experience with investors on these kinds of transactions in Delaware and how rigid the Delaware code is with respect to how to structure them, I think this agreement is a good document for an investor doing a lease purchase conditional sale transaction in Delaware. Okay, so generally a conditional sales agreement, like a real estate agreement of sale, must, at a bare minimum, be in writing, identify the buyer and the seller, must be signed by both parties, must adequately identify the property, include the purchase price, and possibly a closing date and condition of title. But it also needs to include several 25 Del C 314 provisions and should include many others to protect you too. Okay, so let's discuss my conditional sales agreement. Okay, so for our conditional sales agreement, you're going to notice in the first paragraph, this first paragraph essentially covers all of those minimum requirements, or most of them. So you have the parties' names, you have the property address. Also, make sure you include the parcel number. That makes it absolutely clear which property you're talking about. And you know what? Sometimes there is more than one parcel number. If there are, make sure you capture all of them. All right, so we're gonna move on to the agreement section. So the agreement, now we have this concept of there's a lease concept and a sale concept in this conditional sales agreement. And this is largely because of how 25 Del C 314 is drafted. It is a rather confusing and complicated provision. And we're gonna weave that in throughout the discussion. So I won't give you a preview quite yet, but just to say that you're going to see both of those concepts dealt with in this agreement. All right, so section 2, let's deal with the purchase price first. So the purchase price for the property is, let's say it's $100,000. Here on the first blank, you're gonna write ONE space 100, HUNDRED, space 1000, THOUSAND. And we've already put the and 00/$100. Then you're gonna put the numerals in after the $sign, 1000, comma 000, and then we already have the .00 in there for you. Now 2B is dealing with the seller financing component of this transaction. And so that's what a lease purchase is, right? A lease purchase is where the seller is essentially financing the purchase price of the property plus interest to you. Now, I know you may say, well, we didn't really want to do it that way. Well, unfortunately, 25 Del C 314, which governs these kinds of transactions, tells you have to do it this way. So you have to identify a principal amount of the seller financing. So if there's no deposit, or there's no down payment rather, then it's just going to be whatever the purchase price is, right? So if the purchase price is $100,000 and the seller's financing the full amount, it's going to be $100,000. Now, I'm just going to mention at this point as well, so in this video, we're reviewing the buyer version of the conditional sales agreement. I do have a seller version of the conditional sales agreement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the provisions and how they may differ. But the one you're actually going to be viewing for the most part is going to be this conditional sales agreement by the buyer. All right, so section 2B1, the amount of the seller financing, again, we just talked about that. Section 2B2 is the interest rate. This is where you're going to list what the interest rate is. Yes, you do have to identify an interest rate. So what that means is you're going to need to use an amortization calculator. You're going to need, when you're making this deal, to go online, type in the loan amount, type in the interest rate, type in the term, and figure out what the payment is. You can't just randomly make up a payment. I've had clients come to me many times with this, where purchase price is $100,000. We've decided I'm going to pay $500 a month, and $475 of that is going to go to the principal. That doesn't really work, right? You have to think of it as a loan, because that's the way the statute's written. It is construed as a loan, so you need to treat it as such. You need to identify the principal amount, the interest rate, the term, and the payment. Section 3 here, subsection 3 rather, is where you're going to list what the payment is and the maturity date. So this is where you're going to insert the payments in similar fashion to the way you did the purchase price a few moments ago. Same thing with the maturity date on blank 20 whatever. This agreement shall mature, and all unpaid principal and accrued interest hereunder shall be paid. That's indicating when the loan's going to mature. Now, it doesn't have to be a fully amortizing loan. It could be a balloon. So you could amortize the payments out over 30 years, but you could have a 5-year balloon. So that means that the payment is not going to pay them to zero in 5 years, right? It would take them 30 years to pay it to zero with that payment, but there could be a balloon feature where they basically have to refinance. They have to go out into the marketplace and get traditional financing to pay you off. Or we've had situations where the seller then ends up still providing the financing, but we transfer title at that point. So title gets conveyed, and there is a note and a mortgage that's drafted from the seller side. So it depends on the deal that you've made. Subsection 4, the amortization schedule. This is a requirement under Delaware law. You have to include an amortization schedule. So if it's a balloon, it needs to show the balloon at 5 years. If it's a fully amortizing loan and the term is really 30 years, you put the whole 30-year amortization schedule as an attachment here, and the way we have it set up as Schedule A. That's just a requirement that you have. The final settlement we describe in subsection 5. And this is a concept that goes, it's described in the Delaware Code, and I just kind of pull it into the agreement just so the language matches up, and it's a little bit easier. If anyone ever has to go back to the code and look at the agreement, it's a little easier for them to figure out. All right, subsection 6, periodic rental value. This is where it starts to get a little tricky, right? So the Delaware Code says that you have to identify a rental value. All right, so why is that? The reason is if the buyer defaults and doesn't cure within 120 days of the default, then the matter automatically converts into a landlord-tenant matter, and the code provides that this agreement needs to predetermine what that rental payment will be if it in fact converts to a landlord-tenant matter. So you have to decide up front. It also puts some limitations on that payment. It can't just be the same as the amortizing payment. And I know investors would love to do that. That's what they always ask me. Well, let's just make them the same. The code says no. The rental payment cannot be more than 75% of the fully amortized payment, the loan payment. So that means if your loan payment's $1,000 a month, the rental amount that you select in this section cannot be more than $750. $750 or less in that example. Again, this is not a provision that you can just eliminate, you can just waive, you can just decide to do it a different way. This is the way the Delaware Code requires you to do it. So whatever the deposit's going to be is going to be listed in section 7. So in similar fashion to the way you would insert the information for the purchase price, you're going to write the letters of the whatever the number is. If the deposit's $10,000, you write TEN space 1,000 THOUSAND in the first blank, and then you would write 10 after the $sign, comma 000 for that blank that's in the parentheses. So the deposit will be credited to the buyer at closing, which is the conveyance of the deed. Or if the matter converts, remember after the 120-day default, if it converts to a landlord-tenant matter, then there's a formula, and this deposit will become a part of that formula. And that's what this is describing. It's not an election. It's not something necessarily that I think is the best way to do it. It is what the code says has to be done. And you'll notice in here, I have actually cited the Delaware Code 25 Del C section 314D that describes that. I've done that in quite a few different places in this agreement. I do it for the buyer. I do it for the seller. I do it for the counterparty's attorney in the deal, so that if anyone has any question about, well, why is this in here, they can go look the code up and they can see, oh, okay, that's why this is in here. It has to be in here. Late charges are dealt with in section 8, and I think that concept is pretty straightforward. Now, section 3, the buyer default. Boy, this is where we really start to get into the weeds here. So upon buyer's default to make payments due hereunder within 30 days, any such payments becoming initially due, seller may find the buyer in default of his obligations under this agreement by delivering notice of such buyer default to the buyer at the buyer's current address. Okay, so you have to provide written notice of the default. And the 120-day period that I mentioned starts to run upon delivery of the notice of default. So there's a benefit to you to get that notice out as soon as possible. On the one hand, because you don't want the buyer to be in default for too long, and I'll explain to you why in a moment. But you want to get that notice out to get that 120-day cure period started if you're on the seller side, right? So again, we're still kind of going back and forth between buyer and seller on this, but I'm trying to understand or explain the dynamics to you on it. So the buyer shall have 120 days to pay the outstanding balance of the loan to the seller and any accrued interest. And then so basically what's going to happen here is there's a formula that is used to determine if this matter converts to a landlord-tenant matter, what credits the buyer is going to get. All right, so this is going to be the last part of section 3. So if the buyer doesn't pay the loan balance, the agreement will automatically convert to a landlord-tenant agreement, and the buyer shall be entitled to credit of the sum of all of the loan payments made by the buyer. So you got to add up all the loan payments since the uncured default and the deposit, right? So you add up the deposit plus all of the amounts that the buyer paid since the default, and then you subtract from that the rental value through the default period. So I know this gets a little confusing, but let's say there's a $10,000 deposit. Let's say the monthly payments are $1,000, and let's say they made 4 of those payments during the default period. You've got the $10,000 deposit. You've got $1,000 a month for 4 months, right? 120 days. So you've got $14,000 that gets put on the tenant side of the ledger. And then you go back to that monthly rental value, which we said had to be $750 or less. So let's say it's $750, and you have that for 4 months, right? Because that's that same default period as we use to calculate the $1,000. So you have, what, $3,000 getting debited against the buyer tenant. So you have $14,000 as a credit for the buyer tenant, and you have a $3,000 debit or deduction. So the buyer has essentially $11,000 that the buyer can get back. Now the buyer does still have an obligation at this point, although the buyer's now a tenant. The buyer tenant has an obligation to keep making those $750 a month payments. And if the buyer doesn't make those, you can evict the buyer tenant at that point. To the extent you haven't given the buyer the money back, the $11,000, you're going to have to keep taking off that $750 every month, and you're not going to be able to evict the buyer tenant. So now you don't have the right necessarily to just keep that money forever, right, and keep deducting it. Really what you should do is give it back to the buyer, and the buyer's going to have that obligation to make that $750 a month payment. All right, Section 4, maintenance, property taxes, utilities, insurance. So we have in the agreement that as long as it's still a conditional sale, right? As long as it has not converted to a landlord-tenant matter, that the buyer is responsible essentially for pretty much everything. Now that's negotiable, right? It doesn't have to be that way. You can decide that the seller is going to be responsible for certain things as well. But the benefit of the conditional sale is you're out of landlord-tenant world, and you can put all of this stuff on the buyer. So obviously the benefit of that runs to the seller. Now the flip side of this is that if the matter converts to a landlord-tenant matter, you can't do that anymore, right? Under the Landlord-Tenant Act in Delaware, the buyer cannot be responsible for anything and everything that happens with respect to the property. There are limitations. Now I don't get into the weeds on what those are, because this isn't a full-blown Delaware lease and a full-blown conditional sales agreement all wrapped into one. But what it basically says is if the matter converts, then these obligations on the buyer that aren't allowed under the Landlord-Tenant Act, they go away, right? So it describes that. It doesn't really get into it blow by blow as to what exactly those changes are going to be. But it does explain conceptually, and that is to protect all the parties in the transaction. Section 5 deals with the closing and when the closing is going to be. Section 6 is the possession of the property. So obviously the buyer's going to have possession because it's a lease purchase. The buyer's going to have unobstructed possession of the property. 7, the quality of title. So good marketable title. It's got to be insurable at regular rates. Section 8, the apportionment. So this is important when the settlement agent's building the settlement statement. The settlement agent needs to know who's paying for the real estate property taxes, who is paying for the transfer taxes. Are they being, transfer taxes are often split 50-50 buyer and seller. Usually the property taxes are split as of the day of closing, meaning that the seller is responsible for everything up to the day before closing, and the buyer is responsible for everything as of the day of closing and afterwards. You can modify those a bit, and sometimes through negotiation parties do, but that's what's described in this agreement because that's the most common way to do it. I also include a provision in Section 8 here which you could delete, which has some cost sharing of the preparation of the agreement. So if you wanted to have the other party help pay for that, which I have had happen quite a few times on these agreements. So Section 9 says reserved, and what that means is that section was omitted. So it's in one of the other conditional sales agreements that we use for other purposes, but we didn't want to change all of the section numbers because there's cross references in these documents, and that's a lawyer's tool to avoid having to renumber all the section references throughout the entire agreement. All right, Section 10, the survival section. This has the seller's representation surviving closing, which is important because otherwise they would not, or some of them may not. So we want to make clear that the seller's representations with respect to the property are going to survive closing. Now, if you're a tenant in the property for a decent amount of time, that issue starts to become a little bit less. It doesn't completely go away, but it's a little bit less important because you're going to have possession of the property for an extended period of time. Now, that doesn't mean something couldn't have happened a while ago before you got in the property. There could have been water damage. The seller didn't disclose that to you. There could be mold in the walls.
You and your family could be getting sick from it if you're on the buyer tenant side. So there could be other issues, and you want those to survive, those obligations to survive as long as possible so that you have some recourse if you're the buyer. Obviously, if you're on the seller side of this, then you don't want that, right? You don't want the seller's representations to survive. You want them to terminate at the time of the conveyance of the deed. All right, so 11, risk of loss. This gets missed in a lot of agreements, but essentially what this says is what I think people would expect the terms to be, but the reality is if you do not include this in the agreement of sale or the conditional sales agreement, then these terms don't apply, right? At common law, as soon as a buyer signed an agreement that gave the buyer the right to buy the property, the risk of loss to that property shifted from the seller to the buyer. So what does that mean? That means if you enter into an agreement of sale to purchase the property for $100,000 and the next day the property burns down, the buyer is still obligated to pay the seller $100,000 for this property that's no longer worth what it was the day before. And that's just the way it works at common law. So we have to change that in these agreements where you're buying property to make it what I think most people would sort of expect it to be, that risk of loss stays on the seller. And if the property gets damaged or destroyed, that the buyer has a right to cancel the agreement and get the deposit back, right? That's the way I think people would want it to work. Now, how does the seller protect itself? Well, the seller can insure the property and make sure that it's adequately insured, and that way the seller can get paid if something happens to the property. But a provision where the seller agrees to insure the property is not a substitute for this risk of loss provision. I have seen that before. Just saying the seller agrees to keep the property insured doesn't benefit the buyer. It doesn't say the buyer is going to get the insurance money. It doesn't say the seller is going to use the insurance money to rebuild the property. It doesn't even say what kind of insurance in a lot of these cases the seller even needs to have. What if the seller only has liability insurance and doesn't have actual insurance to reconstruct the property? What if the seller doesn't have an adequate amount of insurance? That's another issue. What if it would take $100,000 to rebuild the property, but the insurance is only for $60,000? Well, that's not really all that helpful. All right, 11B is a similar concept as 11A with respect to damage to the property, but it is with eminent domain. So the state decides they want to widen a road, right? Then you may want to terminate the agreement. If they're going to take half the yard, maybe that's a big deal. Maybe that changes the dynamics or the value of the property just enough that you don't want to do the deal if you're on the buyer side. And even if you're on the seller side, I mean, that's not unfair to the seller, because the seller should get compensation, fair compensation from the state for the loss of that property. But it's the seller, right? The seller's the one who's entitled to that and should have to deal with that issue, at least from my perspective. All right, section 12, the assignment sublease. So this says that the buyer may assign this agreement without the prior written consent of the seller. It also says that the buyer may sublease the property to another party, right? So this becomes important on a wraparound type of deal. And now they're not all wraparounds, and there are drawbacks with wraparound deals, and we're not going to get into the weeds on the wraparound deals. But I think if you're going to do some kind of a wraparound, meaning you're going to sublease to someone else or possibly even enter into another conditional sales agreement with someone who's going to buy from you, you really ought to disclose on both sides what you're going to do. You should describe to your seller, if you're the buyer, describe to your seller what you're going to do. I'm going to sublease this thing. I want to sublease it. I may even enter into another conditional sales agreement with somebody on the other end. And then you need to go the other way to your buyer and say the same thing. Say, hey, my rights in this property are by way of a conditional sales agreement, and the rights that I'm giving you are subject to my rights that I have. I'm not the actual title legal owner. And I think you absolutely need to disclose that, because if you don't, and this blows up on you, what's going to happen is an attorney general or whoever is investigating it for the state could very easily think you've committed some kind of fraud,
even civil fraud you could have in court where people think, well, you tried to sell something you didn't own, right? And yes, you could say, well, I'm the equitable owner, and you do have some of those arguments, but you really want to beef those up as much as possible because you don't want to have to deal with those kind of situations. So disclosure is your friend, and that is true in almost all cases, other than when you're, over disclosing and digging your own grave, so to speak. But generally speaking, disclosure is your friend, and disclosure can cure a lot of issues. If you tell people, hey, this is exactly what I'm doing, and not just tell them, but put it in a document so they don't get amnesia later, right? But you've got that documented. You can always come back to this and say, hey, I disclosed to everybody involved exactly what I was doing. If somebody didn't like it, they should have said something then, not at some point after the fact. Okay, so the next section is section 13, seller default. So if the seller defaults in any of its obligations under the agreement, the buyer shall retain all of its legal and equitable rights and remedies under the law. So you want this because if the seller decides not to sell or gets cold feet or whatever the case is, you want, as the buyer, you want to be able to hold the seller's feet to the fire and actually force the buyer to, or the seller rather, to sell the property to you or get monetary damages. So you need that to preserve your rights. Section 14, disclosures. The seller has an obligation to make certain disclosures, radon and lead-based paint disclosures to buyers. And that's what's happening with this provision is they are in fact making that disclosure to the buyer. And it's also notice to the buyer that, hey, these issues should be on your radar too, that you need to be looking out for these kinds of things. Section 15, the attorney's fees provision. So this is a little bit tricky because if the matter converts to a landlord-tenant matter, then the landlord can't get attorney's fees from the buyer, who at that point is the tenant, because the landlord-tenant code says you can't do that. So that's why I put to the fullest extent permitted by law, because there could be some circumstances where that's not feasible. It's not allowed by the law. But the buyer could get attorney's fees if the seller gets cold feet. The seller doesn't want to follow through with the transaction. The seller could potentially get attorney's fees. And so that is a valuable provision, certainly if you're on the buyer side. Time is of the essence. So at common law, it was understood that real estate transactions get delayed. It's just the nature of the real estate business. So in order to avoid that and make all of the dates firm dates, you have to have a time is of the essence provision, which is what section 16 is. Section 17 is the whole agreements section, and this basically says that all of the terms of the deal are in this agreement. There's no other components to this deal that are outside of this written document, that neither one of us, buyer or seller, can amend this document unless both of us agree to amend it and sign something indicating that we're doing that, except for earlier on where we have the buyer tenant has the right in section 12 to assign or sublease the property. That's already effectively pre-approved back in section 12, and we want to make sure we don't have a conflicting provision here, right? We don't want to have one provision that says, this can be done unilaterally, and then another one that says both parties have to agree to all changes, right? No, so we carve out of this one this other unilateral right, basically saying other than this one unilateral thing that the buyer tenant can do, other than that, both parties need to agree in writing to any changes, which I think would be the expectation for everyone. Shouldn't be a controversial provision. Section 18 says the Delaware law is going to govern the agreement. Section 19, the Counterparts provision, says that each party can sign a separate sheet of paper. It doesn't have to be the exact same sheet of paper. Now, I would recommend that once everybody signs the agreement that you do assemble a fully executed copy. So the text of the agreement, all the signature pages, put them all together, scan them in, and email them to all the parties that are involved. If you're exchanging signature pages over email, if you're signing them in person, print out 2 full copies and have each copy signed so that each party gets a fully executed original. Okay, also in this provision, we say that you can transmit these documents via PDF and exchange them to that degree. Now, there is one caveat to that, and that if you're really going to record this agreement, which we're going to talk about in just a few moments, it's a couple of provisions down, you can't exchange these signatures via PDF. So I'll explain that to you in just a moment. Section 20, severability. This section says that if a court found one of these provisions not to be enforceable, they're not going to invalidate the entire agreement. They're just going to invalidate the provisions that the court doesn't like. Okay, section 21. This is one that is different if you're on the buyer side versus the seller side. So if you're on the buyer side, you want this agreement recorded. And why is that? Because you don't want the seller to be able to sell the property to someone else. You don't want them to be able to vest rights to someone else. And so in this situation, you want to be able to essentially tie the seller up, cloud title, so that this property cannot be sold out from under you. Ideally, you also want to have a limitation that says the buyer, or the seller rather, cannot go out and get a new mortgage on the property as well. Now, in terms of recording, you need to have the document notarized with the original notarizations and the original signatures in order to record the document with the county. So it needs to be notarized if you're going to record it. If you're on the buyer side, you want it recorded. You also want to make sure you do a title search on the property before you give a big deposit to the seller, because if the seller says, well, I got one lien on the property for $50,000 and forgot to tell you that he had a second lien on the property for another 100, that might be material to you. You may not want to take the risk of entering into this deal if that's the case. Now, if you're on the seller side, obviously you don't want this document recorded because you don't want the cloud title. You want to be able to refinance. You want to be able to do whatever you want to do with this property and not have to deal with somebody doing a title search and saying, hey, what is this document out here? I don't know if you can do what you're trying to do because there's a document that says there's an issue with that. All right, section 22, representations and acknowledgements. So here the seller is representing that it's made that it has disclosed all of the major defects with respect to the property, and we incorporate the Delaware Association of Realtors definition for the most part into this section. That's important because that survival provision earlier that we discussed, this is a part of what it's helping to survive, right? This is going to survive closing when you ultimately take title. 23, a sealed instrument, has the effect, does two things. One, you don't need consideration for a sealed instrument in the state of Delaware, or at least by a document that's governed by Delaware law, and also it increases the statute of limitations to 20 years. Section 24, if you have additional terms, that is where you would enter them. However, if you're going to add additional terms, I always recommend that you have an attorney help you construct those additional terms. Otherwise, they may not be enforceable to the extent that you think they are. Inclusion, section 23, anything that you want to be sure is included, the dishwasher, the range, whatever it is, put it on there. Exclusions, the seller might want certain things excluded. Write those on there as well. And then legal representation. So this is a provision. It may not be applicable. If you're buying the form and doing it yourself, it's not really going to be applicable. Very often I've been involved in transactions where I'm drafting it and I'm just trying to make sure that everyone knows who I'm representing and who I'm not representing. So if you don't need that provision, you can just go ahead and delete that provision. Okay, now we have the signature blocks. So they really are going to, so the signature blocks include a notarization as well. Again, contemplating the idea that this document is going to be recorded. So you want to have all of the parties have their signatures notarized. And then you'll see Schedule A. This is where you would insert the amortization schedule that was referenced in the agreement. And you do need to fill in some of the terms, the interest rate, the number of months, the payment, and if it's a balloon, whatever the balloon payment is. If there's no balloon, it's fully amortized, then you can delete the line that says balloon payment because you're not going to need it. But you would need to insert the amortization schedule. And the Delaware Code says that the buyer and seller have to acknowledge the amortization schedule. So that's why we have this provision in here where buyer and seller are acknowledging it and a place for them to sign to go ahead and cover that issue and make sure that that part of the Delaware law is addressed. So I know this document, probably above any other document, is one of the more confusing ones because of the complexity of the Delaware Code with respect to this issue. So I do consultations on this concept, whether it's discussing the agreement of sale in more detail, whether it's discussing how to structure it, although we do charge for that. But you can reach out to me at wdolan at dolanlawpa.com if you'd like to schedule a consultation. It's wdolan, D-O-L-A-N, at dolanlawpa.com. We also have lots of other real estate, LLC, and business topic videos that you can take a look at for additional information. But please kindly hit those like and subscribe buttons so we can keep bringing you valuable and profitable content. With that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.